Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The air on a spring afternoon in New England can be deceptive. It can hold the crisp promise of renewal, a clean break from the long, hard winter. But on April 15, 1920, in the small shoe manufacturing town of South Braintree, Massachusetts, that air was about to be filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the metallic tang of fear. It was just after 3 o'clock. The Slater and Morrill Shoe Company paymaster, Frederick Parmenter, and his guard, Alessandro Baradelli, were walking down Pearl Street. They carried 2 steel boxes containing the company payroll, a sum totaling over $15,000, a fortune at the time. It was a routine they had performed countless times. But this time was different. 2 men lounging against a fence suddenly moved toward them. Gunshots cracked through the quiet afternoon. Baradelli, shot 4 times, fell to the ground, mortally wounded. Parmenter, struck twice, stumbled and collapsed, dying the next morning. The gunman grabbed the cash boxes, jumped into a waiting dark blue Buick, and sped away, its other occupants firing wildly to scatter the horrified onlookers. The entire event was over in less than 3 minutes. It was a crime of shocking brutality and ruthless efficiency. On the surface, it was a payroll robbery gone tragically wrong. A local crime story. But this violent act would become the catalyst for one of the most controversial legal battles in American history. It would ensnare 2 men, Nicola Sacco, a skilled shoemaker, and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, a fish peddler. They were Italian immigrants. They were laborers, and they were anarchists, believers in a political philosophy that sought the abolition of all government. A creed that, in the superheated paranoid atmosphere of post-World War I America, was tantamount to treason. Their subsequent trial and the 7-year fight for their lives would capture the world's attention, sparking riots from London to Buenos Aires and creating a legal and moral schism that has yet to fully heal. This was not just a murder trial. It became a trial of ideas, of foreignness, of political dissent itself. The central question that haunts this case, even a century later, is not merely whether Sacco and Vanzetti pulled the triggers. It's whether they could have ever received a fair trial in a nation gripped by the fever of its first Red Scare. It's whether the evidence presented in court was a foundation for justice, or a scaffold built from prejudice. Today, we dissect the anatomy of a politically charged prosecution. We will examine a case where eyewitness testimony was clouded by xenophobia, where ballistics evidence became a battleground of expert opinion and alleged coercion, and where the defendants' radical beliefs may have been the most damning evidence against them. This is the anatomy of a case where fear, as much as fact, guided the hand of justice toward the executioner's switch. To understand the trial of Sacco and Vanzetti, we must first understand the world they inhabited and the world that judged them. America in 1920 was a nation wrestling with its own identity, triumphant from the Great War, but deeply anxious about the future. A wave of patriotism had crested and broken, leaving behind a dark undertow of paranoia. The Bolshevik Revolution in Russia had sent tremors of fear through the West, and in the United States, this fear curdled into a vicious hunt for radicals, socialists, communists, and especially anarchists. This period, known as the First Red Scare, was a time of intense nativism and suspicion. Immigrants, particularly those from Southern and Eastern Europe, were viewed with deep distrust. They were seen not as seekers of a better life, but as carriers of dangerous alien ideologies that threatened the very fabric of American democracy. They were the hyphenated Americans that politicians warned against, their loyalties perpetually in question. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, driven by a mix of genuine fear and political ambition, launched a series of brutal crackdowns. The Palmer raids saw thousands of suspected radicals rounded up, often without warrants, held in deplorable conditions, and hundreds were deported. In this climate, to be an immigrant with radical beliefs was to live with a target on your back. Into this cauldron of fear stepped Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti. They were, in many ways, emblematic of the immigrant experience. Vanzetti, born in the northern Italian region of Piedmont, was a thoughtful, articulate man who had arrived in America in 1908. He was a wanderer, working a series of grueling, low-paying jobs, from dishwasher to railroad laborer to ice cutter. He read voraciously, devouring the works of political philosophers like Proudhon, Kropotkin, and Malatesta. His experiences with poverty and exploitation solidified his anarchist convictions. He came to believe that government and capitalism were systems of organized oppression, designed to keep the working class in chains. By 1920, he was living in Plymouth, Massachusetts, making a modest living peddling fish from a handcart. He was known in his community as a gentle, if somewhat solitary, man of principle. Nicola Sacco was different in temperament, but shared the same ideological fire. Arriving from the southern Italian region of Apulia in the same year as Vanzetti, he was more of a family man, more settled. He found work in the shoe factories of Milford, Massachusetts, and became a highly skilled edge trimmer, earning a good wage. He was married with a son and a daughter on the way. He had a home, a garden he lovingly tended, and a reputation as a dedicated worker. But beneath this conventional exterior was a passionate revolutionary. Sacco was an active member of an Italian anarchist group in East Boston. He helped organize strikes, distributed radical literature, and donated generously to the cause. For both men, anarchism was not a hobby. It was the moral compass by which they navigated a world they saw as fundamentally unjust. Their paths were intertwined with a small, close-knit circle of Italian anarchists in New England. They were part of a movement that the American government was actively trying to crush. They had seen friends arrested and deported. One of their comrades, a typesetter named Andrea Salcedo, was arrested by federal agents in New York after being held incommunicado for 8 weeks on the 14th floor of the Park Row building. Salcedo's shattered body was found on the pavement below. The official report called it a suicide. His fellow anarchists called it murder. This event terrified their community. It was in the shadow of Salcedo's death that Sacco and Vanzetti were operating in the spring of 1920, trying to gather anarchist literature to hide it and raise money for the families of those who had been arrested. They were moving with caution, deeply aware that they were being watched. They knew that one wrong move could lead to prison, deportation, or worse. It was this fear, a rational and well-founded fear for their political lives, that would soon be twisted and used against them as consciousness of guilt for a crime they insisted they did not commit. The investigation into the South Braintree murders began, as most do, with confusion and conflicting accounts. The killers were described as dark-complexioned, possibly Italian. The getaway car was a large, powerful Buick. These were the only solid leads. The local police, led by Chief Michael Stewart of Bridgewater, began to explore a possible connection to another earlier crime. On Christmas Eve of 1919, a similar payroll robbery attempt had occurred in the nearby town of Bridgewater. In that instance, the bandits failed to get the money, but the description of the men and their vehicle bore a striking resemblance to the Braintree job. Chief Stewart believed the same gang was responsible for both crimes. His attention turned to a man named Ferruccio Coacci, an Italian immigrant and known anarchist who worked at the Slater and Morrill shoe factory and had been fired shortly before the Braintree robbery. Coacci was slated for deportation, and on the day after the robbery, he failed to show up to a meeting with immigration officials. When Stewart went to Coacci's home to investigate, he found another man there, Mario Boda. Boda, also an anarchist, owned a smaller, less reliable car, an Overland. But Stewart learned something crucial. Boda stored his car at a local garage owned by a man named Simon Johnson. Stewart instructed Johnson to call the police if anyone came to pick up the Overland. On the night of May 5, 1920, 20 days after the Braintree murders, 4 men arrived at Johnson's garage. They were Mario Boda, another man named Riccardo Orciani, and with them Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti. Mrs. Johnson told them her husband wasn't there, and her demeanor made the men suspicious. Fearing a police trap, they left without the car. Sacco and Vanzetti parted ways with the other 2 and boarded a streetcar heading toward Brockton. Mrs. Johnson, meanwhile, had called the police. An officer boarded the streetcar and arrested the 2 men. The arrest itself was a moment pregnant with misunderstanding and fatal consequences. When questioned, both Sacco and Vanzetti were carrying loaded pistols. Sacco had a .32 caliber Colt automatic and extra ammunition. Vanzetti carried a .38 caliber Harrington and Richardson revolver. When the police asked why they were armed, the men lied. They denied knowing Mario Boda. They gave false information about where they had been and what they were doing. From the police perspective, this was classic consciousness of guilt. Here were 2 armed Italian men, lying about their activities shortly after being connected to a vehicle possibly used in a robbery. It seemed an open and shut case. But from the perspective of Sacco and Vanzetti, their actions were born of a different kind of fear. They were not trying to hide guilt for a robbery. They were trying to hide their radical political activities. They knew Boda and Orciani were fellow anarchists. They believed the police trap at the garage was part of the government's ongoing crackdown on their movement. In their minds, they were being arrested for being radicals, not robbers, admitting their true purpose, gathering anarchist leaflets, and warning comrades of impending arrests. Would have been admitting to the very activities that could get them deported, just like their friend Coacci, or worse, killed, like their comrade Salcedo. Their lies were not an admission of murder, their defenders would argue, but an act of political self-preservation in a time of extreme persecution. This fundamental clash of interpretations, consciousness of guilt versus consciousness of radicalism, would become the central pivot upon which the entire case would turn. The guns they carried, common for men in that era, but suspicious to the police, and the lies they told, intended to protect their political allies, would instead become the first threads in a legal net that was quickly closing around them. Before Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti were tried for the murders in South Braintree, the authorities decided to first prosecute Vanzetti for the earlier failed robbery attempt in Bridgewater. It was a strategic move by the prosecution, led by District Attorney Frederick Katzman. A conviction in the Bridgewater case would brand Vanzetti as a violent criminal in the public mind, making a subsequent conviction in the more serious Braintree murder case all the more likely. The trial took place in Plymouth in June of 1920, presided over by the same judge who would later oversee the Braintree trial, Webster Thayer. The evidence against Vanzetti in the Bridgewater case was exceptionally weak. The prosecution relied almost entirely on eyewitness testimony, which was a mess of contradictions. Multiple witnesses swore that the man they saw holding the shotgun had a trimmed, croppy mustache. Vanzetti, at the time of his arrest, and for years prior, had a long, flowing handlebar mustache. Over a dozen witnesses for the defense, all of them Vanzetti's regular fish customers in Plymouth, testified under oath that he had been in town selling eels for the Christmas Eve feast at the very time the robbery attempt was taking place miles away. Yet, the jury, likely influenced by the prevailing anti-immigrant sentiment and Vanzetti's identity as a known anarchist, convicted him. Judge Thayer handed down a sentence of 12 to 15 years, an unusually harsh sentence for an attempted robbery in which no one was hurt and nothing was stolen. The verdict was a devastating blow, and a grim foreshadowing of what was to come. Almost a year later, on May 31, 1921, the main event began. The trial for the South Braintree robbery and murders opened in the courthouse in Dedham, Massachusetts. The atmosphere was electric. The courtroom was packed, the press was in a frenzy, and armed guards patrolled the grounds. Sacco and Vanzetti were brought into the courtroom each day in a heavy iron cage. The imagery was stark and powerful. Two foreign radicals, caged like animals, being put on trial by a nervous and hostile establishment. Presiding over it all was Judge Webster Thayer. Thayer was a man who made no secret of his biases. He was intensely patriotic, a proud member of the American elite, and he harbored a deep-seated loathing for radicals, whom he referred to as those Reds and anarchistic bastards. Numerous accounts from credible sources, including a Dartmouth professor and a prominent lawyer, later surfaced, quoting Thayer boasting outside the courtroom about his intention to get them good and proper and teach a lesson to the radicals. While these statements were made outside the official proceedings, they paint a chilling portrait of the man who held the defendant's lives in his hands. The prosecutor, Frederick Katzman, was a skilled and ambitious attorney. He recognized that the physical evidence linking Sacco and Vanzetti to the crime was thin. Therefore, he built his case on three pillars: questionable eyewitness identifications, highly contentious ballistics testimony, and, most importantly, the defendant's own behavior and beliefs, which he would masterfully frame as evidence of a guilty conscience. Katzman's strategy was to put anarchism itself on trial. The eyewitness testimony was, once again, the foundation of the prosecution's case. One after another, witnesses took the stand to identify Sacco or Vanzetti. But under cross-examination, their stories often fell apart. One witness, Mary Splain, claimed she had a clear view of Sacco in the getaway car, for about 3 seconds from a second-story window, a significant distance away. She described him in detail, noting his good-sized left hand, yet she had initially told police she could not make an identification. It was only after seeing Sacco in custody that her memory supposedly sharpened. Another key witness, Louis Pelzer, a shoe cutter, claimed he saw Sacco from a window and even ducked as Sacco pointed a gun at him. On cross-examination, he was forced to admit that he had initially told investigators he hid under his workbench and saw nothing. He later claimed he had lied out of fear, but his credibility was severely damaged. The identifications of Vanzetti were even more tenuous. Multiple witnesses described the man with the shotgun as being light-haired, while Vanzetti had dark hair. No witness could definitively place him at the scene. The descriptions of the robbers were consistently inconsistent. They were tall, they were short, they were cleanse-haven, they had mustaches, they were light-complexioned, they were dark. The only consistent theme was that they looked foreign. In the cultural context of 1921 Dedham, this vague descriptor, leveled at two Italian men sitting in a cage, carried an immense weight of prejudice. Katzman paraded these witnesses before the jury, building a narrative through sheer volume, hoping that the accumulation of flawed and contradictory identifications would create an illusion of certainty. It was a strategy that relied less on the quality of the evidence and more on the jury's willingness to believe that where there was this much smoke, there must be fire. With the eyewitness testimony riddled with inconsistencies, the prosecution turned to what it hoped would be its trump card: forensic science, specifically ballistics. The science was still in its infancy in the 1920s, and its presentation in court could often be more art than science, relying heavily on the authority of the expert witness. The state's case centered on the .32 Colt automatic pistol found on Sacco at the time of his arrest, and a single spent shell casing found near the body of Alessandro Baradelli, designated Bullet 3, which was believed to be the fatal bullet. The prosecution brought forth two state police captains, William Proctor and Charles Van Amberg, to testify as ballistics experts. Their testimony would become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case. Van Amberg testified with confidence that the fatal Bullet 3 was consistent with being fired from that Colt automatic. This phrasing was crucial. It wasn't a definitive match, but to a jury unfamiliar with the nuances of forensic science, it sounded damning. He implied a certainty that the science of the day simply could not support. Captain Proctor's testimony was even more problematic, and its true nature would only come to light years later. On the stand, Katzman asked him a carefully worded question. "Have you an opinion as to whether Bullet 3 was fired from the Colt automatic that is in evidence?" Proctor replied. "I have," Katzman asked. "And what is your opinion?" Proctor responded. "My opinion is that it is consistent with being fired from that pistol." Again, the word consistent. It was ambiguous, but it gave the jury the impression of a match. The problem was, this was a deliberate deception. Years later, during the appeals process, Captain Proctor signed a sworn affidavit that revealed the shocking truth behind his testimony. He stated that he had repeatedly told Katzman and another prosecutor that he did not believe Bullet 3 came from Sacco's pistol, and that he could find no evidence to support such a conclusion. He claimed that Katzman had pressured him to find a way to testify for the prosecution, and they had concocted the consistent with phrasing as a way for him to answer truthfully but ambiguously. In his affidavit, Proctor stated plainly, "I did not intend by that answer to imply that I had found any evidence that the so-called mortal bullet had passed through this particular Colt pistol. Had I been asked the direct question, whether I had found any affirmative evidence whatever that this so-called mortal bullet had passed through this particular Sacco's pistol, I should have answered then, as I do now without hesitation, in the negative. This was a bombshell. It suggested that the district attorney had knowingly presented misleading testimony on the single most important piece of physical evidence in the case." The defense countered with its own experts, who testified that it was impossible to say for certain that the bullet came from Sacco's gun. They pointed out inconsistencies in the rifling marks and argued that the state's experts were overstating their conclusions. The battle of the experts left the jury to decide which authoritative-sounding man to believe. In addition to the bullet, The prosecution also focused on the .38 Harrington and Richardson revolver found on Vanzetti. They argued that it had belonged to the murdered guard, Baradelli. Their evidence was thin. Baradelli was known to have dropped his gun off for repair weeks before the murder, and the repair shop had no record of him ever picking it up. Furthermore, the shop owner testified that the gun he had worked on was a different model. Despite this, Katzmann relentlessly pushed the theory that Vanzetti was carrying a dead man's gun, a powerful and prejudicial suggestion. The forensic portion of the trial was a masterclass in prosecutorial maneuvering, creating an aura of scientific certainty around evidence that was at best ambiguous and at worst deliberately misrepresented. The defense, led by the flamboyant and radical West Coast lawyer Fred Moore, faced an uphill battle. Moore's strategy was unconventional. Instead of focusing solely on disproving the evidence, he chose to embrace the political nature of the case. He argued that Sacco and Vanzetti were not on trial for murder, but for their anarchist beliefs. He wanted to expose the prejudice and political motivations behind the prosecution. While this strategy brought international attention to the case, it may have backfired with the conservative, patriotic jury in Dedham. Moore's theatrical style and his association with other radicals alienated the courtroom establishment, including Judge Thayer. The defense presented a robust alibi for both men. For Sacco, they produced a witness from the Italian consulate in Boston who testified that Sacco had been at the consulate on the day of the murders, inquiring about a passport to return to Italy. Several other witnesses from Boston's Italian community corroborated this, remembering him from a banquet that day. For Vanzetti, a dozen of his customers from Plymouth testified, just as they had in his first trial, that they had bought fish from him on April 15th. The prosecution's response was to viciously attack the credibility of these alibi witnesses. Katzmann implied that because they were mostly Italian immigrants, and some were fellow anarchists, they were all lying to protect their comrades. He painted the entire Italian community of Boston as a suspect class, their testimony inherently untrustworthy. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when Sacco and Vanzetti took the stand in their own defense. This gave Katzmann the opportunity he had been waiting for, to cross-examine them not about the robbery, but about their political beliefs. He grilled Sacco relentlessly on his views about government, patriotism, and the flag. He asked Sacco why he had fled to Mexico during World War I to avoid the draft. Sacco, speaking in broken English, but with fiery passion, tried to explain his anarchist philosophy, his love for his family, and his belief in a world without war or government oppression. To the jury, however, his words likely sounded like a confession of disloyalty and radicalism. Vanzetti, more eloquent and philosophical, also tried to explain his beliefs and his reasons for lying upon his arrest. He spoke of the fear that pervaded his community in the wake of the Palmer raids and the death of Andrea Salcedo. He told the jury, "I was afraid for the movement. I was afraid for my comrades, for my friends." He was trying to explain the consciousness of a radical, but Katzmann expertly twisted it into the consciousness of a killer. The prosecutor's closing argument hammered this point home. He barely mentioned the contradictory evidence. Instead, he painted a picture of two dangerous men, un-American radicals, who were enemies of our institutions, and whose very character made them capable of such a brutal crime. He asked the jury to do their patriotic duty. On July 14, 1921, after deliberating for only a few hours, the jury returned with its verdict: guilty, guilty of robbery, and guilty of murder in the first degree. The courtroom erupted. Sacco screamed in Italian, "You kill two innocent men." Vanzetti stood stoically. The verdict was not just a legal finding. It was a reflection of the deep social and political divisions of the era. The jury had chosen to believe the flawed eyewitnesses over the alibi witnesses. They had chosen to accept the ambiguous ballistics testimony as fact, and most significantly, they had chosen to interpret the defendants' unpopular political beliefs as proof of their criminal guilt. The trial was over, but the fight for the lives of Sacco and Vanzetti had just begun. The guilty verdict transformed the case from a local murder trial into an international cause célèbre. A wave of protest and indignation swept across the globe. For millions of people, Sacco and Vanzetti were not vicious killers, but martyrs, victims of a prejudiced and unjust American legal system. The Sacco-Vanzetti Defense Committee, which had been working throughout the trial, redoubled its efforts, raising funds, publishing pamphlets and organizing rallies. Intellectuals, artists, and legal scholars, including figures like Albert Einstein, H.G. Wells, and future Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, lent their voices to the cause, decrying the trial as a gross miscarriage of justice. Over the next 6 years, the defense team filed a series of appeals and motions for a new trial, all of which landed on the desk of the original trial judge, Webster Thayer. Each motion presented new evidence or highlighted flaws in the original trial. They challenged the prejudice of the jury foreman, who had allegedly said before the trial, "Damn them, they ought to hang anyway." They submitted the damning affidavit from Captain Proctor, revealing the deliberate deception behind his ballistics testimony. They produced evidence of collusion between the prosecution and federal agents from the Department of Justice, suggesting that the government had been monitoring the anarchists and may have helped frame them to crush their movement. Each time, Judge Thayer denied the motion. His written decisions were long and defensive, defending his own conduct and that of the prosecution, while dismissing the new evidence as irrelevant or untrustworthy. The most dramatic development came in November 1925. A man named Celestino Medeiros, a young Portuguese immigrant already sentenced to death for a different murder, passed a note from his cell in the same Dedham jail where Sacco was being held. The note read, "I hereby confess to being in the South Braintree Shoe Company. Crime and Sacco and Vanzetti was not in said crime." This was a stunning confession. Medeiros later signed a detailed affidavit, claiming he had been part of the robbery with a notorious Providence-based group of professional criminals known as the Morelli Gang. His account of the crime matched many of the known details. The Morelli Gang fit the description of the bandits far better than Sacco and Vanzetti. They were known to use a Buick for their robberies and were notoriously violent. For the defense, this was the key that could unlock the cell doors. However, the prosecution worked tirelessly to discredit Medeiros, painting him as a pathological liar, trying to delay his own execution. Once again, the motion for a new trial based on this confession landed before Judge Thayer, and once again, Thayer denied it. He ruled that Medeiros was unreliable, and that his confession was not credible enough to warrant overturning the jury's verdict. The legal avenues were closing, one by one. The system that had convicted Sacco and Vanzetti seemed determined to protect that conviction at all costs, regardless of any new evidence that emerged. As the execution date loomed in the summer of 1927, public pressure reached a fever pitch. protests turned into riots in Paris, London, and other world capitals. In response to the growing outcry, the governor of Massachusetts, Alvin T. Fuller, appointed a special advisory committee to review the case. The committee was headed by Abbot Lawrence Lowell, the president of Harvard University, and included two other prominent members of the Boston establishment. The Lowell Committee, as it came to be known, interviewed witnesses and reviewed the evidence over several weeks. Hopes were high among the defense supporters that this independent body would finally recognize the injustice of the trial. However, the committee's final report was a bitter disappointment. While it mildly rebuked Judge Thayer for his grave breach of official decorum in discussing the case outside of court, it ultimately upheld the jury's verdict. The committee concluded that the trial had been fair, that the Madero's confession was not credible, and that Sacco and Vanzetti were, in fact, guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. For many, the Lowell Committee's report was the final betrayal, a sign that the state's most powerful institutions were closing ranks to endorse a verdict they believed was fundamentally flawed. With the governor's refusal to grant clemency, all hope was lost. In the final weeks, Vanzetti, the more articulate of the two, penned letters and essays from his cell that spoke with a profound and tragic eloquence. He wrote not just of his own innocence, but of the larger struggle for justice for the poor and the oppressed. On April 9, 1927, when he and Sacco were brought before Judge Thayer for their formal sentencing, Vanzetti delivered a final, powerful speech to the court that would become one of the most famous declarations in American legal history. He spoke of his suffering, of the prejudice he faced, and of the cause for which he was about to die. He told the judge, "I have had to suffer for things that I am not guilty of, but my conviction is that I have suffered for things that I am guilty of. I am suffering because I am a radical, and indeed I am a radical. I have suffered because I was an Italian, and indeed I am an Italian. If you could execute me 2 times, and if I could be reborn 2 other times, I would live again to do what I have done already." On the night of August 23, 1927, 7 years after their arrest, Nicola, Sacco, and Bartolomeo Vanzetti were put to death in the electric chair at Charlestown State Prison. Sacco's last words, spoken in Italian, were, "Long live anarchy." He then added in English, "Farewell, my wife and child and all my friends." Vanzetti was calm and dignified. His final statement to the warden was, "I wish to tell you that I am innocent, and that I have never committed any crime, but sometimes some sin. I thank you for everything you have done for me. I am innocent of all crime, not only this one, but of all. I am an innocent man." Shortly after midnight, the current was applied. The men who had become global symbols of a politicized justice system were dead. In the century that has passed since the executions, the debate over the guilt or innocence of Sacco and Vanzetti has never truly ended. Ballistics technology has advanced considerably, and modern tests conducted on the surviving bullets and casings have yielded conflicting and inconclusive results. Some tests in the 1960s suggested a match to Sacco's pistol, while later examinations in the 1980s and beyond have cast serious doubt on those findings, suggesting the evidence may have been tampered with or misinterpreted. The case remains a historical puzzle, the truth obscured by the passage of time and the passions of the era, but to focus solely on the question of guilt or innocence is to miss the larger, more enduring lesson of this case. The true anatomy of the Sacco and Vanzetti prosecution lies not in the contested grooves of a bullet, but in the social and political forces that shaped their trial. This was a case where the defendant's political beliefs were not merely context, but were actively used by the prosecution as evidence of a criminal disposition. District Attorney Katzman put their anarchism on the stand, presenting their flight from the draft and their distrust of the government not as political acts, but as the behavior of hardened criminals. The consciousness of guilt argument was a brilliant and devastating inversion of their reality. The very fear and secrecy that were rational survival mechanisms for radicals during the Red Scare were presented to the jury as the furtive actions of murderers. The trial was also a stark illustration of how deeply prejudice can infect the mechanisms of justice. The constant emphasis on the defendant's Italian heritage, the dismissal of their Italian-speaking alibi witnesses, and the general atmosphere of xenophobia created a courtroom where Sacco and Vanzetti were fundamentally other. They were judged not as individuals, but as representatives of a feared and despised group. Judge Thayer's out-of-court pronouncements, if true, reveal a judiciary not as a blind arbiter of facts, but as an active participant in a cultural war against perceived enemies of the state. Ultimately, the Sacco and Vanzetti case serves as a chilling reminder of the fragility of justice in times of great national anxiety, when a society is gripped by fear of immigrants, of radical ideas, of social change. The legal system can become a tool for enforcing conformity rather than discovering truth. The burden of proof can subtly shift, and the presumption of innocence can be eroded by the presumption of ideological guilt. The state executed two men based on evidence that was, at best, deeply flawed and, at worst, deliberately manipulated. Whether they were factually innocent or guilty of the crime may be a question lost to history, but the trial itself left an indelible stain on American jurisprudence. 50 years to the day after their execution, on August 23, 1977, Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis issued a proclamation. It stated that Sacco and Vanzetti had not been treated justly, and that any stigma and disgrace should be forever removed from their names. It was not a pardon, which would imply guilt, but an official acknowledgement that the trial itself had failed to meet the standards of a fair and impartial process. The proclamation was a vindication of a sort, but it could not restore the lives that had been taken. The legacy of the case is a permanent and cautionary tale, a lesson etched into the annals of American law, with the lives of a shoemaker and a fish peddler. It demonstrates that the greatest threat to justice is not always the commission of a crime, but the perversion of the process used to judge it. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.